Here's your word for the day from Calvary in Lake Havasu. Visit us on the web at calvaryaz.com.
Hello, Calvary. I have your word for the day as we continue through Mark. We're in chapter 13. Now, a few days ago, you encountered this question. The disciples asked Jesus, when will these things happen? Specifically, they're talking about the end times. And the disciples were like, when will these things happen? And Jesus is still answering that question when we come down to verse 14, which is where we're starting today. So I'm going to read verse 14, and then I'm going to encourage you to read the rest of that paragraph on your own. But verse 14 says, "But when you see the abomination of desolation standing where he ought not be, let the reader understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains." So that question the disciples asked is, when will these things happen? And the answer starts out, when you see the abomination of desolation standing where he ought not be. Now, this is a reference to an Old Testament passage. This is a reference to Daniel chapter 11, verse 31. Take a note of that, Daniel 11, 31. Go back and read it. And it's talking about a time when the temple will be desecrated. When the temple will be desecrated, where the temple will be dishonored or become a place where worship can't take place anymore. Now, there's a couple of options on when to understand this. One option is to understand that this was completed in about 70 AD when Titus, a Roman ruler, came into Jerusalem and came into the temple and desecrated the temple, and then the temple was destroyed. So some people are reading this passage of Jesus' teaching and saying, well, this took place in 70 AD when the temple was destroyed. Other people look at it and say, no, I don't think that's what he's talking about. Maybe that's a foreshadowing, but what's going to happen at a later date is the temple will be rebuilt and there will be another desecration. There's a different abomination of desolations that's coming. And when that happens, then it ushers in this great tribulation. And Jesus does tend to, it seems to indicate that there is this great tribulation that happens after this abomination of desolation and the temple being desecrated. So what does Jesus say, regardless of when and where this happens, what does Jesus say to do in this scenario? Well, he gives us this list. First in verses 14 through 17, he tells the disciples to flee, to get away from Jerusalem when this happens. The next thing he tells them in verse 18 is to pray. He tells them to pray when this happens. He also wants them to know that God's going to limit the extent of this tribulation. We see that in verse 20, that there will be a limit to this tribulation that the believers go through. And then he says to be discerning, because there's going to be this temptation to stray, to believe something false. And so he says to be discerning. You see that in verse 22. Doesn't want the believers to be deceived. So Jesus has all this teaching. And my question is, what do we do with this today? Well, when we come to that time of great tribulation, I think, we can honor this. We can do what Jesus says. But the fact is that we encounter different types of tribulation all the time, different types of struggles, different types of persecution and difficulty. And Jesus' words here apply not only to when we face a great tribulation, but when we face the little tribulations in our life as well. I think that fleeing from tribulation is an okay response sometimes. We can't get away from every tribulation, that cancer diagnosis, that child that's ill, that relationship that's broken. We might not be able to flee from it altogether, but when it's possible to flee from tribulation, that's a okay response. But also we have to pray. We have to pray that we can stand up, that we don't lose faith under the pressure that we're bearing, that we know how to respond and how to love God and love others even in the midst of difficulty. We can know that God sets limits on tribulation. In the book of 1 Corinthians, Paul tells us that God won't allow us to be tested beyond what we can bear, and that he will provide a way of escape in that midst of that tribulation or that testing. So whatever you're going through, know that God is still in control and that he sets a limit on that so that you will be able to stand up underneath that testing or that trial. Be discerning in the midst of your tribulation. Man, I know sometimes when we're struggling and we're going through a difficult time, it's really easy to believe lies, to believe things that aren't true, to doubt God's goodness. And, Jesus says, whatever tribulation you're going through, be discerning. Don't believe a falsehood. And I think if we follow these things, if you can get away from tribulation, do it. If you're in a tribulation, pray. If you're in a tribulation, know that it's limited. And if you're in a tribulation, be discerning and don't fall away from the truth. Those are 4 great things that we can do. Whether we're facing the great tribulation or whether we're facing a small tribulation, Jesus' words here will help get us through. I hope that encourages you today, Calvary. Have a great day. Bye.